Hello and bonjour. You're watching Power Dilemma with Sarah Bukhari at TAG TV. The Telegraph writes Donald Trump, President U.S., dug in his heels over a controversial zero-tolerance immigration policy that has seen thousands of children forcibly separated from their parents at the Mexican border. Mr. Trump pointed to Europe, which he said had become a migrant camp, and said that would not happen to the United States under his leadership. Speaking at the White House, the U.S. President said, and I quote, "The United States will not be a migrant camp and it will not be a refugee holding facility. You look at what's happening in Europe and in other places. We cannot allow that to happen. Not on my watch." Mr. Trump spoke amid an uproar among Democrats and Republicans as images of children being held in wire mesh cages and toddlers crying as they were separated from their mothers emerged from the border. The president said criminals were using children like a Trojan horse to get into America, that a country without borders is not a country at all, and that people coming in were bringing death and destruction, he added. They are thieves and murderers and so much else. Hundreds of children are being held at a converted former Walmart store in Texas. Another detention center in Texas has been nicknamed La Perra, the dog kennel in Spanish. Democrat politicians who were allowed to tour La Perrera saw one cage with 20 children inside. Children were sleeping on the floor on thin mattresses with foil sheets as blankets. Recently, today, I think a few hours earlier, President Trump has signed a presidential executive to stop this detention. To talk about this, we have a political consultant, Crystal Smaldon, and she has worked with Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, as well as Vice President Joe Biden in the U.S. I'm very lucky and feel honored to have Crystal Smaldon in my show to talk about this very pressing issue. Welcome to my show, Crystal.
Thanks for having me, Sarah.
Okay, so Crystal, what is your take on this situation going forward?
You know, on a go-forward basis, I mean, obviously the Trump administration does not want to see children in the situations in which they've been put thus far, or that's been portrayed in the media. In fact, I don't think any American, Canadian, or human would want to see these situations continue to roll out. I think the executive order that will be issued today, or has already been issued today, will speak highly of the commitment of this executive to make this right, make it better, and make it work with dignity.
Okay, when you look at these kids in cages, that, pains my heart. I'm a mother, and pains a lot of other, it continues to be a very painful experience watching these kids in cages. So why would he think of putting the kids in cages?
You know, I think that this is a little bit of a bigger issue than kids in cages. I think we have to remember as a society that this has been going on for some time, and I'm not saying that makes it right. What we have to remember is there are varying circumstances in which these children are placed in detention, and those include things that we may or not be thinking of on a typical day. A lot of these children are being trafficked by people who are pretending to be their parents. A lot of these children are arriving unaccompanied, so they don't even have an adult with them. And the situation in which they are in, or in which they are being held, obviously needs some kind of change created for it. But in many situations, they're safer in the environment in which the Americans put them in than they are out on their own. So there's definitely some work that needs to be done. There's definitely some change that needs to be created. I look forward to the president's executive order later today to see that change be created in an appropriate manner.
Okay, you just mentioned that you want to see the executive order. What is the meaning of that executive order? Our viewers would like to know.
My understanding of the executive order, as it should be laid out today, will be the stoppage, immediate stoppage and reunification of children with their parents. That's not going to immediately stop the kids in cages, so to say. What this means, or what we're expecting to see from this executive order, is that the separation of lawful and legal parentage will stop. What that means is if a child arrives at the border with someone that Americans are able to prove is their actual biological parent, they will not be separated under any circumstance. However, if there's no way to prove that this is actually their parent, meaning they may be in a human trafficking situation, they may be being sold for, various purposes, or they may arrive unaccompanied, there may still be situations where children do need to be put into detention. However, we need to keep in mind that the order is highly expected to read that biological proven parents will not be separated from their children at any border crossing.
Okay, so our viewers would also like to know, what is this third country agreement between U.S. and Canada, and how can Canada help at this situation?
The third world country agreement has a lot of facets to it. It includes things such as we would ensure safety in our borders. It ensures that we are able to take in a certain amount of migrants, a certain amount of refugees, a certain amount of asylum seekers. It allows us to work together in those partnerships, but it also allows the transference of human capital across the borders. So what this means for Canadians is that the American stance can be as it is such, and they will deal with their own. But as Canadians, we have an open heart. We have a more open border procedure that some may say is more humane in many situations. The Third World Country Act won't change either of those situations, but it does allow us to take in people as we see fit.
Okay, so do you also think that this very action by President Trump is also geared towards impeding the wall, which he has proposed between Mexico and U.S. border?
I don't want to put words in the president's mouth. I mean, there's been lots of speculation, so to say, of why these things are happening. I think one thing we need to keep in mind is that President Trump isn't the one physically removing children from their parents. He's not the one who physically created this law. And in many circles, people may say this actually isn't a law. Some people may say it's a policy or an order. That has still to be clarified on both sides of the border. It's impossible to actually figure that out by the varying reports that we've read at this point. What I can say from the political perspective, however, is that it appears that there will be change. There will be change coming, and that change will be good for families.
Okay, so what is the reason behind these acts by President Trump?
Are you referring to the acts of the separation of parents and families?
Yes, this very political development which occurred, detaining kids accompanied by people who are crossing the borders.
The one change that appears to be causing the chaos that we're currently in is that change that's been brought down by Attorney General Jeff Sessions. And it appears that they have now created an environment in which it becomes illegal. And by law, that means that if you come over a non-legal port of entry into the United States of America, you will be prosecuted as a criminal. When you are prosecuted as a criminal, what happens is your children are removed from your custody because you're put into a detainment center, otherwise known as an ICE facility across America. When an adult is put into an ICE facility, they are removed from the children are removed from their custody. That is actually the progression of what's occurred. That is a newer policy shift by Attorney General Jeff Sessions. So I believe that in fact, will be part of the executive order change, that either children will go to the detention facility with their parents, or there will be a separate housing unit for refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers who may be wrapped up in this family separation.
Going forward, steps like this, how are you seeing a new, the new emerging United States?
That's a big question, Sarah. The United States has changed so significantly in the last year and a half that it's almost impossible to guess what could possibly happen next. I think what we have to look at is both sides of the border. We are in the middle of what's about to become probably the most intense trade war we've seen and maybe will see in our entire lives. We are about to see the transference of children, hopefully back to their parents. We're about to see a lot of different shifts that as a human with morality and and kindness can be difficult to take, especially from a political perspective, when you have a multitude of different people telling the president what to do and how to do it. It's hard to know what's going to happen next. What I think is important is that someone got into the ear of the president and let him know that change had to be created. And I hope for both the American and Canadian people that more people continue to get into his ear and tell him change must be created.
Okay. No, it was very good to talk to you, Ms. Crystal Smalton, and we will be talking to you again. Thank you very much for coming into my show.
Thanks, Sarah.
Okay, so the President Donald Trump, United States President Donald Trump, has faced severe condemnation from the Committee of Nations, and he did sign a presidential executive to reverse this detention of the kids. We were going to take a short break, and once we come back, we're going to continue.
Greenish Hair, Skin and Nails formula is packed with all the essential nutrients like biotin, omega-3, vitamins, and minerals to provide your hair, skin, and nails the nourishment that it needs. Like all other Greenish vitamins and supplements, the Hair, Skin, and Nails formula is gluten-free, dairy-free, soy-free, and non-GMO. It is also halal, kosher, and veggie certified. So make Greenish Hair, Skin, and Nails formula a part of your daily healthcare routine.
Welcome back to Power Dilemmas. Before the break, we were talking about President Donald Trump's very controversial detention of kids in cages. In this part of the show, we are going to talk to Professor Nelson Weisman about the recent victory of the Progressive Conservatives in Ontario. This is the first time the PCs will form government in Ontario since 2003, with leader Doug Ford expected to be sworn in as Premier in the coming weeks. The PCs released a long list of promises before the election called A Plan for Ontario, but didn't include a detailed fiscal plan or a path to eliminate the deficit. That raised eyebrows as Ford campaigned repeatedly, promising, "We are the only party that's fiscally responsible. We are the only party that is accurate." The plan included a wide variety of promises, from a pledge to reduce hydro bills by 12% to reducing income tax and reforming education. So to talk about the promises made by the Progressive Conservative Party and the status of the Liberals, we have in our studio by phone Professor Nelson Weisman of University of Toronto. Welcome to my show, Professor.
Thank you.
Okay, so Professor, first of all, you predicted in my previous shows that Progressive Conservatives will win the election. How would you term the Liberal Party now? They have lost the party status. What is the meaning of losing party status?
Well, first let me say it's up to the new government if they want to give the Liberals party status. We've had situations in the past where a party doesn't meet the bar. In Ontario, it's 8 seats, and the governing party extends party status. But I'll tell you what it means and why the Conservatives might extend it to the Liberals, although I don't think they should. If a party has party status, it gets research funds. Mm-hmm. That's very important because most of the people elected to the legislature, if they haven't been cabinet ministers or shadow cabinet ministers, are really amateurs in the policy field in which they're asked to deal with, like bills that come up, which are technical. Research funds allows you to hire people who can research the issue so that you can speak from a more informed position. So that's one big advantage of having party status, although the amount of money you get is related to the number of seats you have. So even if the Liberals got party status, they would still only get a fraction of the amount of money that the NDP, for example, gets, because the NDP won, I think, 40 seats. And the Conservatives would also get research money, but in a way they don't even need it because they've got the whole government bureaucracy that has great research capacity that works for them, but they can use the funds in a more partisan way. Another advantage of party status is that the party gets a regular turn and question period. And the leader of the party is recognized as the leader of the third party. That's what he or she is called. And after the leader of the opposition has her questions, the leader of the third party is recognized by the speaker and to have his or her questions. Or if it's not the leader, it's anyone that the leader designates in her party. So this raises your profile. If you don't get to ask questions in question period, the media don't get to report on what you asked about. Now, it doesn't mean that MPPs who are in a party that doesn't have official party status never gets to ask questions, but they don't get to ask them very often. Maybe once every couple of weeks or so, and thus they get a lot less attention. Now, it may also be the case, but I don't know this for certain. It is the case federally that if you have official party status, your party leader gets a stipend from the public purse. I don't know if that applies in Ontario law, but that would also mean that the leader would get some money. And I can assure you that the Liberal Party is in need of money because it probably spent all the money it had and went into debt in the election campaign.
Okay, so you mentioned that you don't think so, or that Ford, the Premier designate, should give Liberal Party a status. Do you want to elaborate on that, please?
Yes, and I'll tell you why he might decide to do it. Now, it would have to be voted to begin with by the legislature, but that's not a problem for the Conservatives because they have a majority of the seats. So even though the NDP, I think, would oppose it, and I think they would be right to oppose it, the Conservatives could get their way. Now, why would Ford want to do it? And why do I think it's a bad idea? First, let me tell you why I think it's a bad idea. I think we should go by the rules that everybody understood before the election, and I don't think the rules should be changed after the election. If you were going to change the rule, you should have said you're going to do it before the election. Now I'll tell you why Ford might very well do it. Because it's in the interests of the Conservatives to have a fragmented parliament, to have a split between the Liberals and the NDP. It's in their interest to have three parties competing, because if you have three parties, you don't have to get 50% of the vote. You only need a plurality of the vote. Like in this election, I don't remember exactly what percentage of the vote they got. I think it was 40%. So they became a big majority government with only 40% of the vote. And I think that most of the people who voted Liberal, more of them would have selected the NDP as their second choice had the Liberal Party not been there, had it not existed. So by giving a party official party status, you're raising the party's profile, and thus it will ensure that the Liberals are better positioned in the next election, and that would serve the interests of the Conservatives.
Okay.
You see the logic here?
Yeah, I got that. Okay, moving forward, PC's made a lot of promises to Ontario citizens. How do you think they're going to carry the promises?
I don't think they can meet these promises. I mean, some they can meet, and some, but overall, they're not going to be able to meet their fiscal targets of balancing the budget. I mean, I think even during the campaign, they said it wouldn't be balanced in the first year. I don't think it'll be balanced throughout their whole term. Now, first off, a lot of how successful you can be depends on how well the economy performs. Because if the economy is performing very well, you're bringing in more taxes. But if the economy performs very poorly, or we go into a recession, that many more people are on welfare, are unemployed. They're not paying taxes. So that's always a wild card in the system. But the Conservatives promised that they wouldn't cut any essential jobs. Well, if you look at things such as teachers, doctors, nurses, that's a very large proportion of what the provincial government spends money on. They also said they wouldn't fire people. Okay, they've now introduced a policy, they say, of not hiring new people. But that's people in the narrow public service. These are the people that work directly for the government, not teachers, professors, nurses, municipal workers, and so on. And the number of people that work in the Ontario public service, even if you eliminated all of them, I don't think it would eliminate the deficit. There are many more people who work in the broader public service. That is, people like myself, much of whose money comes from through government, but we're not. If you're not cutting anybody, and you can't do it directly, like professors or teachers, municipal workers, nurses, then you don't have that much impact. And can you actually provide the same level of services by even cutting people in the narrow public service? For example, if you go to Service Ontario, there are currently lines. Well, what happens if you don't replace the people there? The line, you want to renew your driver's license in person? Maybe rather than taking an hour, it'll take you 3 days.
Okay. How about hallway healthcare? Do we see any betterment in terms of our healthcare system?
No, this term hallway healthcare has been used in other provinces. I've seen the NDP use it in Manitoba, and I've seen it used in other election campaigns. Yeah, it's a catchy phrase, but the reality is that unless you really boost spending to create new hospitals, hire more nurses, make more medical spaces available in medical schools for more doctors, you're not going to solve the problem. So I don't think when it comes to healthcare, you need sort of more dramatic, almost revolutionary changes. Like right now, most doctors are essentially private business operators. If they were salaried employees, like nurses, or wage employees like teachers or professors or municipal workers, then you might be able to lower costs in a way. But sure, nobody wants to be in a hallway in an emergency room when they need admission. But we've had parties in various provinces saying they're going to solve this problem, and when they're terming office ends, the problem still seems to be there. All you can really hope for is that the problem is mitigated. It's not as acute as it was when the party came into power, but we didn't get concrete proposals from the Conservatives about how that's going to happen.
Okay, so NDP makes the official opposition. What do you foresee? What is the role of NDP? How are they going to stop some bills into becoming into legislation?
I don't think they can stop bills from coming into legislation because we have tight party discipline. I think what will happen is they'll get more publicity than they did in the past.
Okay.
So when they make speeches and put out papers about what they would do or what's wrong with what the government is doing, I think that's going to get more attention in the media, in newscasts, on radio and television, and in the print media. but I can't see the NDP stopping whatever the Conservatives want to do. The only way that would happen is if you had divisions in the Conservative caucus. And while I don't know what's going to happen in the future, based on what we've seen in the last few decades, that's unlikely to happen.
Okay, I'm just going to ask you one last question. I don't know if it's connected to the Ontario politics or not. It is about legalizing of marijuana. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau just announced in his last session of the Parliament that 17th of October will be the date when marijuana will be legalized in entire country. What impact it's going to have in Ontario, or how it's going to go with the PC government?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't know the answer. What I think will happen is it'll take time from experience to feel our way around as a government and as a society, and for businesses to see how things are going. And although it's federal legislation, it applies in all the provinces, and my understanding of the legislation is that the provinces can implement it in different ways. So, you know, if one wants government stores, they can have government stores. If one wants to turn it over to the private sector, they can turn it over to the private sector. Somewhat like alcohol. You know, Alberta has a completely different system than the LCBO. So it applies to Ontario, and I don't know what the Ontario regulations are. We'll see how Ontario's regulations work out under the law. And Ontario, of course, I guess will pass its own laws and have the authority under those laws to change things as things unfold. So it's like a discovery period. It's like, you know, we'll see how things go.
Do you have your vote in favor of marijuana, or you're against it?
Am I for it or the legalization? Well, it's happening. It hasn't gotten royal assent, but I guess it will in the next few days. My attitude was that we should decriminalize it rather than legalize it. But, you know, I'm not an authority in the field, and I think other jurisdictions have tackled this as well. And we now have more experience from the United States, states like Washington and Colorado, and I'm sure that those experiences have been very carefully monitored by the federal government and helped inform their legislation. So whatever the case, whether you go to decriminalization or legalization like is now happening, the old regime of illegality and throwing people in jail or giving them really criminal records, even if you didn't throw them in jail, was not sustainable in light of the fact that I think about half of Canadians had tried marijuana at some point. So, in effect, you had half of Canadians who had broken the law.
Okay.
And when so many people break the law, it tells you that, you know, you don't want laws that are broken by the majority or near majority of people, because it undermines law itself.
Okay. Professor, it was very good to talk to you, and I hope, I know that you have to go. I would have loved to ask you a lot more questions, and you know, hopefully next week we can talk to you again. Have yourself a good time. Okay, so that was Professor Nelson Wiseman of University of Toronto, and we were talking about the Progressive Conservative win in election 2018, about promises. We also talked with Crystal Smalden about President Donald Trump's very controversial act of detaining kids in cages. We are going to follow this story in our coming weeks, and stay tuned. Keep watching Power Dilemmas, and I would like to sign off. You take care of yourselves, and ciao.